is me. I'm going to round off this regulatory session with a regulatory issue, which is encapsulated on this title here. It's an issue which has become increasingly acute over the past years, and I have developed some views, and I want to emphasize that these views are absolutely my own. I have to say this in a desperate effort to retain my job, and I just hope it works. Okay, this talk addresses the issue of the requirements of patients with primary immune deficiency who are given immunoglobulin. As we all know, the most important illness which these patients have, if they're not treated, are respiratory infections, particularly in young children, and these come about as a result of infections in the lungs. I am myself not a clinician, but they are extremely serious if not treated. One of the biggest problems is the fact of underdiagnosis and inability to transition. And this slide just summarizes some of the clinical issues in terms of the pneumococcal aspects of these infections. And it is the case that although, curiously, the products to treat these patients are not specified for specificities for antibodies against these infections, it is the case that surveys show that in most of the products there is adequate content of antibodies against these infections, which, as I said, are of the primary importance in patients with PID. And this slide just summarizes that fact that in the survey for these various organisms, there was an adequate and protective level of these antibodies, except for a couple of preparations in relation to meningococcal serogroups. I should say that, as usual, well, I mean, the presentation will be available eventually, but anybody who wants this can have it immediately so that I can perhaps gallop through. So that's a good thing. Although, as I said, I've always been intrigued that the relevant specificities are never required by regulators. What I want to talk about today is some other specificities, is some other activities, which are in fact specified in the standards. And these include organisms such as measles, tetanus, and so on. And I have specifically focused on the question of measles. So in this particular publication, there are the specific antibody levels in IVIG preparations in this instance against various pathogens. And you can see over there that they are actually detailed in regards to the companies. This is public information, so I'm not divulging anything confidential here. And that you can see that in relation to measles, what immediately strikes you, or at least it strikes me, is the enormous range and the variability within the same preparation from different companies. Now, as of some years ago, in fact, it is quite some years ago now, it has been observed that in relation at least to measles, there has been a very marked drop in the titer to this specificity in the plasma donors, which contribute to these products. And this, of course, is pretty much in line with the initiation of the era of mass vaccination to this particular disease. And this, of course, has led to an increasing level of concern in relation to the attainment of the regulatory standard for the content of this particular antibody in immunoglobulin products. Because on both sides of the Atlantic, this happens to be one of the requirements. Now, it has always been curious, and it has always been debated, in fact, as to whether this is a relevant specificity for patients with PID. I think myself it is relevant, although, as I said, it is curious that other specificities which are perhaps more directly related to respiratory disease are not specified. Be that as it may, it is the case that this drop in titer in donors eventuated, as I said, through mass vaccination, has gradually led to a decrease in the titer in the donors and to the product. And this has now reached a level of acute concern on the part of the industry and of the regulatory overseers as to what is going to happen in relation to the maintenance of the relevant standards. And in fact, in the I don't know what they call it, but anyway, in the mid-2000 to 2010 decade, the FDA, in this instance, I'm going to mention a lot, the FDA, decreased its requirement in order to basically get rid of the problem and allow the maintenance of production with a standard which was according to their requirements. They basically dropped the standard. I think it happened about 2004, 2005. Now, let's look a bit at different populations in relation to this specificity. You can see here data from the Czech Republic. And basically, you can see what is virtually accepted and visible from the previous slide, that older individuals will still have adequate titers of the measles antibody, whereas, of course, the younger people who have been vaccinated more recently drop below. So that is the situation in the Czech Republic. It is not just, in fact, in relation to measles, and I put up the slide in order to immediately focus attention on, I think, an important point, which is that this is something which varies across geographies. Here we have another vaccine-related antibody, in this instance hepatitis A, and you can see here that in the European Union, in this particular study, some years ago, you can see that the titers in EU plasma were quite higher than those in the United States. So the point is, there are areas where one can focus attention in relation to accessing, if necessary, the required titers for manufacture. If you look again at the respiratory-related illnesses, you can see similar phenomena, and sometimes these are significant and sometimes not. And you can see in this data, and this is coming from Baxter, nowadays called Takeda, in which you can see these differences, but there is only one particular organism, respiratory syncytial virus, serotype B, in which this is actually significantly different. That is between the United States and the European Union. Now, coming back to the issue of measles, which is the primary focus of my attention, this is again a more, if you like, structured assessment of the progression over the years, correlated with the introduction of waves of vaccination programs, and reiterating the point, perhaps in more detail, on the previous slide. And this is a nice body of data put together by the industry. I think there was more than one company, but if I recall correctly, it was Toby Seiben from CSL who led this particular publication. So it's a question of, yes, the vaccinations. In studies which were done within the previous publication, in calculations based on titer of donor plasma, CSL's and the other colleagues' conclusion was that if the lot release specification could be lowered from 0.48 to 0.30 of the FDA's reference material, this will accommodate declining measles neutralizing antibody levels in the donor plasma. And wonderfully, within a few months of this publication coming out, the FDA, in fact, did precisely that. And the relevant requirement was lowered to pretty much what was suggested in the previous paper, to a bit higher than that, 0.36. And this, it is hoped, will remove this problem. Now, I would contend that it is clearly the case that unless other measures are done, this is not removing any problem, it is simply postponing it for another 10 years or so. Now I come to a country with which I have some familiarity, as do some members of this audience in the front row, and this, of course, is Australia, the right way up. And of course, Australia is a civilized country with a public health system, which is very good. And we have the same situation in terms of vaccination. But I want to draw your attention to the interesting fact that in this slide summarizes, okay, 4 sero surveys over the past 20 years or so. And it is the case that there is declining levels of antibodies to measles. This slide shows the percent which are positive serologically. So there's no quantification here, okay? Although obviously there is something in the assay. And it shows that basically, yes, we have the same problem, but we still have a considerable number of people in our particular demographic still within the age at which they can donate blood and plasma who have adequate levels of the antibody. So that's the first, or reiterating the point about geographies. This is a very interesting paper, co-authored amongst others by a person who is in the front row to my right of this audience, which looks at, very interestingly, domestically manufactured, or rather immunoglobulin products sourced from domestic plasma in Australia by a company which you are aware of, in relation to the measles antibody levels in both intramuscular and intravenous immunoglobulin products. So these are the domestic products, okay? Now, what is interesting in this publication to me, first of all, there's an interesting situation which I commend CSL for having analyzed further in relation to the assays. Because the ELISA, which is basically the assay used because it's easy to do to specify products, gives somewhat different results to the bioassay based on plaque neutralization. And perhaps Joe would like later on to make some comments as to why this should be. But what interested me in this slide are 2 points. First of all, the actual levels of antibody and the periods of interest where one would have expected declines to form on the basis of the American slides is reasonably constant. The other point, which interests me greatly, is that the levels in intramuscular preparations are considerably higher than in intravenous. This obviously, as is pointed out in the paper, is a function of the manufacturing method. The manufacturing method for intramuscular immunoglobulin is still basically embedded very much in the traditional cone scheme, whereas, of course, the particular method used to manufacture IVIG in this paper and in many other schemes currently used for IVIG manufacture deviates considerably. And it is interesting that the intramuscular method retains much more of the specificity. What needs to be remembered as well, and the old people here will remember this, that as of about 30 or 40 years ago, we still had an intramuscular preparation, which was in fact a protective antibody preparation for measles, available for use. Keep that in mind. This again is a data set which summarizes the situation from the Australian paper, very comprehensive. It looks at all the plasma and all the products which are manufactured by CSL, and you can see again that there is an increase in the intramuscular. There is an increase, perhaps not significantly, between the products manufactured in Australia and the products manufactured in the other geographies where CSL holds sway. But it is interesting again and of great relevance that when you do the biological assay, this difference tends to more or less fade. This is a similar set of data. I haven't gone into rubella because it's not as widely concerned at the moment, although I suspect it soon will be. And basically it shows again that the IM product retains higher levels. This is some very recent data from the brilliant group. I have to say that I have a tremendous respect for the group of Thomas Kreil, in which they look at, again, measles neutralizing antibody titers in their immunoglobulin lots, and they compare US to Europe. You can see the difference between the geographies. in relation to the types of plasma. Recovered plasma gives more, always. This is pretty much, in my view, a reflection of what we always see in regards to source plasma Ig content, although I am intrigued that the levels in European source plasma are also lower and approach those of the United States despite significantly lower intensivity in the plasmapheresis regime. This is basically the trend in regards to the, in this instance, United States source plasma, and what is interesting and perhaps encouraging is a sort of leveling off in the decline in relation to the decrease in specificity. And this is the conclusion of Thomas Kreil's group in relation to this issue from plasma collected in Europe or the United States, that it should be possible to attain the regulatory standards on both sides because of the data which they have shown. Now, I have purposely tried to source every single company that I can which has published this data, not just to perhaps show some objectivity, because I'm not aligned to any of these companies, I'm aligned to another company, but to basically make the point that there are differences between the companies in relation to this, and these differences are coming about because they have different products. There is a controversy all the time as to whether all immunoglobulin products are the same. I think the data in this particular instance, as well as with practically every instance, shows that indeed they are not the same. And for this reason, because we are concerned in relation to the well-being of patients, Isabella Quinti, my collaborator in Rome, and I wrote a short paper in which we urged very strongly for more attention to be given to this issue and for the need to focus attention on the collection of plasma in all regions in order to be able to access high-titer plasma where this is available. Because there is no doubt that in some geographies this is still the case. And until we solve this problem in other ways, and I'll make comments about how we may be able to solve this issue in other ways, it is important to be able to source this plasma. So, ironically, Jan, perhaps not so ironically, because I think you made similar comments last year in Budapest, ironically, in relation to this issue, I am making a sustained argument for self-sufficiency. And I want to round off in this short talk with some reflections. I think that this problem, the reason why I called this an unholy alliance is perhaps a bit dramatic, perhaps a bit exaggerated. These are not qualities which I usually exhibit, but in this instance perhaps it is the case, that there is this unholy alliance between regulators and industry to solve this problem by basically dropping the standard. And this means that in another 10 years, as I said, as the cohorts of donors move closer to the low-titer cohorts of the purely vaccinated population, we will have to do it again. And this is no solution. It is absurd. We need a more systematic approach. And this has to include consideration of the appropriate manufacturing method. We cannot afford the current residual stock in the population of adequately high-titered measles antibody plasma to be dissipated in manufacturing methods which do not retain the specificity. If we are to solve this problem, or to address it at least until a longer-term solution comes up, we have to think very seriously about this in the context of personalizing production as well as personalizing medicine. Everybody these days talks about personalized medicine and the need to personalize to treatment. It's become the current sexy way of addressing medical issues. Well, I think we also need to specify manufacturing methods. And I suspect that one possible solution should be that plasma, which is still high-titer in measles specificity, should be manufactured perhaps with the IM method of cone and then used to blend, if you like, with the standard IVIG. And of course, nowadays we must not forget that some companies have subcutaneous products which would be lacking this specificity. And as I have said before, I reiterate that the issue continues to highlight the need to access plasma from all the possible geographies. So that's all I have to say about this, and thank you, and if you wish to use the residual 5 minutes of time to ask me questions, abuse me, exhibit my ignorance, I am at your disposal before I make the final closing remarks of this session. Thank you.
Dr. Marucci, I would like to use this opportunity to introduce you. That's a wonderful occasion. You just made a comment about...
Whatever turns you on, yeah? And I mean,
You made a comment about where in the segment you are a supporter of self-sufficiency. I'm not going to go into a discussion about self-sufficiency.
you said this as well in relation to Brazil last year, remember?
What I said was that we're living in a global world. I think the problem that you're addressing could also be addressed in a different way. I think it's time to start thinking about developing different poles and not only to a region. With all the traveling that's going on nowadays, where you're going to be exposed to pathogens, you should not be limited to a region. And I'm a supporter to thinking about the concept of a global pool and blend more of your antibodies.
But I don't think we are differing in what we respectively have said, yeah, because I am absolutely demanding access to all geographies.
I do have a comment.
I think she was before you, Joe.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very thoughtful. I have to defend FDA. At PPTA, we spent a lot of time working on this project, as you may know. And it was very difficult for FDA to make a conclusion about lowering the titer for the measles antibodies. And it will be good to say that together with this recommendation, they actually made recommendation about the treatment of patients with increased dose of immunoglobulin or the additional dose of immunoglobulin if the patient is exposed to measles.
Well, I would contend that that's not a good recommendation. We do not increase the dose of medicines because the medicines we have are subpotent. We make the medicines more potent.
I agree with you, but still, I would like to continue. And my point, second point, is that we didn't actually see measles infections, to my knowledge, in patients with primary immune deficiencies, which is very significant thing. I don't think that this is going to happen in the future with what is happening in Europe and what is happening in the United States in terms of measles infection. On the other side, I would like to be optimistic because these people who are getting measles right now are going to contribute hopefully to a plasma pool and build up again the level of antibodies in plasma.
I hope you're not suggesting that we should allow them to get sick so that we can make more money.
On the other side, I completely agree with you that it will be nice to see continuity in the production of immunoglobulins in terms of the specificities which they present. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Bertolini now.
Well, I think I agree with all that, and that was the question that I was going to ask. What did we need in order to ensure neutralisation?
I don't know.
And in those papers that I was involved with, there was a lot of discussion to try and work out, it's very hard to work out, to specifically say how much you need to use.
Yeah, but look, Professor Van Hagen is obviously an expert and he'll move in on this, but my point is this, I have no idea what the detail is. But I think that whenever we go around saying, oh, well, people haven't actually got sick, and is it clinically relevant, etc., these are, okay, pertinent questions, but they're dodging the issue. The issue is, should we decrease standards simply because we are not as convenienced as we were before, especially when we can maintain those standards if we can make a bit more effort. Now, I recognize Professor Van Hagen.
Another question. I'm intrigued about you already show the difference in the level of anti-measles, because we are facing measles again in Europe, between intramuscular and intravenously. Do you think that it's possible that the exposure and the release of your preparation, which is probably slower from intramuscular, so and intravenously gets a high exposure to the neonatal Fc receptor, which are quite constant, and maybe block and increasing a high degradation of your anti-measles or whatever antibodies. Do you think that can be?
Well, look, I'm sure Joe will want to say something about this, but look, that result was on the content within the vial. In other words, it was not an assessment of the post-treatment values. I am not surprised when I think about it from the knowledge of confractionation that this is happening. And this has happened in other aspects of immunoglobulin specification, some of which have nothing to do with hyperimmune titers and so on. But I'm not surprised. Okay, but I reiterate that we did have high titer, hyperimmune, intramuscular anti-measles antibody, and I think that that knowledge is still embedded in the industry and should be of use in this problem. Joe, you want to say something more?
Well, I agree with you that manufacturing procedures have an effect. I have specific data on it.
Thank you for that ringing endorsement. And I will now, as is my duty, bring this session to a close. It's been a great honor for me to be associated with these individuals. I want to especially, not that I want to decrease the contribution of Dominica and myself for that matter, but I do want to especially recognize the significant effort made by the Italian speakers. It is the case that in this country, English speaking is not as embedded. This is a very proud country in relation to its language. And one of the main reasons, I think, is that when we watch Hollywood movies and television in this country, we always hear it in absolutely fluent Italian. And I think this is one of the reasons, and it's a good thing that we have this in this country. For my own, as I said, I am immensely honored. It is quite probable, in my mind, that developments in my life will perhaps make this my last PPB. And it's been a good run. I was involved in the first two meetings. The first one was in Australia, so they involved me. The second one was in Malta, so they involved me. And 2 years ago, Bertolini called me up again to say, listen, the guy who was supposed to be regulating, doing the regulation session has jumped ship, will you do it? I said, okay. So now we're in Italy, they involved me again. I don't know if I'll be back again, but it's been great fun. And I hope that you will take the recommendation of the person who introduced the session and this evening do what you want.